You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
You know what they put in the water, don't you? Fluoride. On the pretext that it strengthens your teeth. That's ridiculous.
I came across this article, a nasty NAFTA-related surprise, Mexico's soaring obesity, and it characterizes a pattern that's been going on for the past several decades of pouring cheap junk food into Mexico and watching people eat it, join the new North American economy, and line up just like Americans for a big healthcare bubble and a life of chronic diseases. The problem is so big it can't be ignored, but it's almost too big for anyone to really notice. Is the same old diatribe about diabetes and obesity and the link between unhealthy behaviors. And it's also the story of the people who create the setting of society, who set things up and watch them fall.
January 1st marked the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA became one of the world's largest trading blocs, eliminating almost all tariffs on trade between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico.
Hi, again.
Yeah.
The people who've poured in this money, who've actually invested huge sums of money to push this stuff on people, knowing the problems that it would create. And it was done, ironically enough, under the mandate of ending hunger and providing cheap food for poor people.
In trade, there are always sectors that win or lose, some more than others.
You're talking about an issue so big that it's determined the health of an entire generation. Of course, you hear a lot about obesity soaring, the healthcare crisis going on, the Western world getting fat, but really, if you look at the charts that have been released from the WHO, the United States is the fattest country, and Mexico is the number 2 fattest country. Canada's not too far behind. The United States and Mexico top the list across the entire world, even though it's been linked to being the strange curse of the wealthy nations. The affluent nations, Mexico's still very poor. Other very wealthy European nations, much lower on the list. You don't see this problem in the same way in Europe. For one reason or another, they just absolutely dwarf the other countries on the list in terms of obesity rates, and the problem's just getting worse and worse, and it clearly has picked up steam since the 70s and 80s, and an overwhelming amount of the food-growing resources were poured into making cheap corn that not only fattened cows in staggering new numbers, but fed a junk food epidemic of cheap filler foods made of corn and soy, loaded and overloaded with sugar and salt, and just really driving the modern epidemic that's been going on. And although there's a lot of factors, including first and foremost personal responsibility, we're talking about shockwaves in the distribution system and the supply system. We're talking about worldwide tectonic moves that have been coordinated on a global level. This is how they build the society. If you've ever heard the parable of how to catch a wild pig, it applies to humans as well. You catch a wild pig by first finding a place out in the woods or somewhere and throwing out corn. The pigs begin to come, they like to eat the free corn, they want the free handout. And when they get used to coming every day, you start by putting down just one side of the fence. You wait till the pigs get used to it, they keep coming back, they eat more corn. You put up another side of a fence, and gradually you build all 4 sides of the fence. And the pigs continue to come and go freely, they take the free corn, they line up for the handouts, until one day when the gate shuts behind them. And the entire herd of pigs who've become adjusted to it, who've become used to it, who've gradually learned to accommodate this system, are suddenly completely captive to it. They've lost their freedom, and they can run around inside the fence, but they're caught, and yet they go back to eating the free corn. Even to the point that if the gates open, they won't run out. That's how they build this captivity. That's how much control the system has built into this. When NAFTA hit in the 90s, it had a major impact on American manufacturing. It challenged wages. It created new pockets of poverty.
Pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for your labor, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
And there were all these declining areas, especially in the Rust Belt in the Midwest of America.
And I said, well, how does it stop being disruptive? And that is when their jobs come up from $1 an hour to $6 an hour and ours go down to $6 an hour, then it's leveled again. But in the meantime, you've wrecked the country with these kinds of deals.
And at the same time, a major hit was happening in Mexico because NAFTA took over the agriculture, it destroyed small farms, and it created a wave of displaced Mexicans, many of whom came north, at least 500,000 per year that they admit, if not 1 to 2 million, driven off of their farms, unable to find a living, and either driven into Mexico City and the ever-growing urban areas of Mexico or just into the United States itself, where instead of families raising food and living off of subsistence farms and eating healthy vegetables and etc., they're suddenly eating out of convenience stores, the cheapest, crappiest food that there is.
Obviously, some of these small subsistence farmers have not been able to compete, but more than compete with, say, US growers, the challenge has been within Mexico itself. It's hard to compete with big agribusinesses in Mexico.
You've got poor people living off of very poor foods that were pushed in through a huge corporate wave. It's pretty astounding, and yet it immediately brings up all these left-right political issues, the border wall, immigration, left versus right, Trump versus Mexico.
As President Trump is now looking to deliver on his campaign promise of building that wall, and he wants to see the prototypes in person.
Look, we're going to have a border. It's going to be a real border, and we're going to build a wall, and it's going to be a serious wall.
And only deeper underneath that are the larger trade issues that were set in place by NAFTA and the kind of people who've amassed the power to dictate the world. It put them on the grid for eating cheap food instead of producing nutrient-dense food, and it created a wave of mass migration that affected the U.S. economy as well and created all these political issues.
The challenge has been, how do you mitigate that social impact? But it has to do with social policies, not with trade.
The New York Times profiled William Ruiz Sanchez and his family, who spends days grilling burgers and slathering fried hot dogs with pepperoni and cheese at his family's restaurant. Though members of the Ruiz family sometimes eat here at their own restaurant, they more often go and grab dinner at Domino's or McDonald's. They buy Doritos and Cheetos at OXXO, a convenience store chain. And the entire family experience has changed over the past several decades, from the days when their grandmother sold tamales and made home-cooked food with produce that was grown at a nearby farm, and her children played outside, collected vegetables, meat was a luxury, and they had a very basic kind of diet. Since then, the Ruizes have become both consumers and participants in an extraordinary transformation of the country's food system, and one that has saddled them and millions of other Mexicans with diet-related illnesses, and many, many Americans too. Again, the obesity rate is highest in the U.S. and second highest in the world in Mexico. And they say this seismic shift has an underappreciated cause: free trade. It explains how Mexico began lifting tariffs and allowing more foreign investment in the 80s, a transition to free trade given an exclamation point in 1994 when Mexico, the U.S., and Canada entered the North American Free Trade Agreement, but few critics predicted it would transform the Mexican diet and food ecosystem to increasingly mirror those of the U.S. Then it has these interesting numbers. In 1980, 7% of Mexicans were obese, a figure that tripled to 20.3% by 2016. And diabetes is now Mexico's top killer officially. And not only is this terrible trend happening, but they're actually saying, well, this is a sign of prosperity. It's actually not the worst thing. Millions and millions of people are getting sick. They're contributing to their own deaths. The system is rigged, especially against poor people in this country and other countries. It's rigged against everyone who hasn't educated themselves about the food issue and taken action. And the message that comes across subtly, not from an official voice, but from somewhere on high, is if you eat this stuff, you somehow deserve it. And so they argue that, well, the economy's more stable now. Mexicans are living longer. Why more people are dying from non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease? It's a symptom of relative prosperity. So the infant mortality rate is down, people are living longer, but they're getting chronic long-term diseases. But that's a sign of prosperity because they moved up out of the world where hunger itself was a big problem into the realm of food-related illness. Wow. Professor Alicia Galvez has written extensively on the problem of NAFTA, eating NAFTA, Mexico in a post-migration and post-labor era, and she's co-written this article as well. During the campaign, President Donald Trump threatened to withdraw from NAFTA, calling it a disaster since the day it was devised. But last week, he said he'll bring NAFTA up to date through renegotiation. However, neither Trump nor those on either side of the trade wars has given any hint that they know anything about one of NAFTA's most distressing consequences, its adverse impact on the health of the Mexican people. In the early 90s, Mexico chose to hitch its wagon to the U.S. and Canadian economies. It agreed to eradicate its import substitution, tariff, and price support systems, as well as subsidies of corn, historically the most important crop in Mexico. And as the dominant partner in the deal, the U.S. won the right to export and invest more in Mexico without having to reduce its own domestic corn subsidies. Now, more than 2 decades later, our research shows that the agreement has transformed Mexico's food system and diet, leading to dramatic increases in obesity, diabetes, and diet-related diseases. How did this happen? First, in the decade and a half since NAFTA was signed, the Mexican agricultural economy collapsed, which has provided access to affordable food for most Mexicans. This drove 500,000 people to migrate every year, and millions more were internally displaced. Farmers who had grown their own food moved to cities where dense populations, aggressive marketing, and ubiquitous availability of American processed food changed the diet of most Mexicans. Between 1994 and 1998, direct investment from the U.S. in Mexican food and beverage companies quadrupled. Changes in food availability led to changes in diet, and between 92 and 2000, calories from sugary sodas among Mexicans increased 40%, and for children they doubled. In the same period, the cost of pesos per calorie of food tripled, making the low-cost, unhealthy food imported by U.S. multinationals more attractive, especially to poor people. The NAFTA diet led to changes in health. Between 1988 and 1999, the prevalence of overweight and obesity in Mexico almost doubled from 33% to 59%. The prevalence of diabetes increased 30%, and diet-related chronic diseases caused 75% of all deaths by 2004. People are dropping dead. And of course, this creates direct and indirect costs for healthcare, both on the Mexico side of the border and, as everyone knows, on the U.S. side of the border as well. It's a North American issue, just like they say repeatedly.
I think it's been an unmitigated success story, not only for Mexico, I think for the 3 countries. What many people don't seem to get is that because of NAFTA, we no longer export Mexican products, U.S. products, or Canadian products. We're exporting North American products because our production and supply chains have become fully integrated.
All the globally groomed, international friendly leaders in both of these countries and in Canada as well just keep talking about this being a North American issue and how, well, yeah, there's winners and losers. Yeah, sure, people are getting sick, but it's better overall. They're wealthier. They've done away with hunger and malnutrition. Well, actually just with hunger, because they found that poverty and malnutrition and obesity and malnutrition go hand in hand. And of course, it's not just NAFTA related, and it's not just Mexico. As I've mentioned, there's a huge obesity epidemic across the whole country. This town in West Virginia has now been named the fattest town in the entire United States, and it's yet another declining Rust Belt city where all the good jobs moved away, and nutrition just took a nosedive as the population declined into poverty, and, it hasn't been good for a lot of places in the country. Of course, a lot of people know that the Farm Bill and the farm subsidies in general pour millions and millions of tax dollars into growing more corn. They've covered that in films like King Corn, about what the real reason is for growing so much of this corn, and basically has been fueling the NAFTA era since the 70s, when corn farmers started growing more corn than ever, more cattle than ever was being raised, and more junk food than ever was put on the market. The 70s, the 80s, it just transformed into this 90s and 2000s NAFTA era and set the trend. They had this ready to go. They did it first in the United States. They made corn sugar, they made corn snacks, and they fed corn to the beef, and this whole thing took off. And once they set it in place in the U.S., once it became attractive to Mexican migrant workers who came over, they took it back home, and then they invested in that market and raised a whole bubble of 2 countries and almost an entire continent hooked on this junk food. Mexico became a dumping ground for cheap U.S. soda, fast food, and snacks formulated from subsidized corn, sugar, and soy crops that are the building blocks of disease-promoting processed food industry. This isn't about one country versus the other. A lot of it is about the North American Union, but it's not just the NAFTA trade agreement. If they do renegotiate it, I wouldn't expect it to get any better. This is about a system that creates policies that allow corporations to weaponize their marketing strategies and for control to go above and beyond and outside of the reach of government while using the government as a tool as well. It's about the part of the agreement designed as a trap because they consider you a mark. Learning what people respond to, what they'll buy, how to coordinate purchases over a season. A double-edged sword that was sold in an effort to feed the world cheap food and which became a weapon of malnutrition and disease. These are issues big enough to determine the health of an entire generation. What kind of deals are we getting where corporations can determine the livelihood of a nation and use populations as a dumping ground? These are markets of death being forced into everyone's matrix, and people are programmed to self-destruct because they're programmed to eat these foods and not recognize the destructive design behind it. And they're creating a North American epidemic that might as well be termed an epidemic of the Federal Reserve, of fractionalized banking, of government imperialism, of CIA meddling, and of population control aims that overarch all of it in the global architecture. And you've got these targeted money interests transforming the diet of an entire people and the vitality of an entire nation, and sets off a healthcare crisis which will render great expenditures both north and south of the border. Millions of people were displaced as most of the farmland was taken over by large corporations. Migrants set off to cross the border or head to the big city. And the invasion of culture, with both welcome and unwelcome side effects, has transformed and negatively impacted, and it's done so by a largely economic conquest. The solution that everyone's asking for and searching for and hoping to find is virtually self-evident. Being healthy is so simple, it's staring us in the face, but a lot of people can't live up to it. The big question is, how do we all get there? Individually, as a society, what's the right way to encourage this to happen? And what kind of restrictions go too far and take away free will and free choice? Either way, the solution is easy to envision, so there's got to be some way to get to it. Personal accountability is at the very top of the list, but there's also an important need an economy that is free from parasitic nature. There's a very big problem that people don't want to face with the way in which corporations dominate and decide what people get to eat. And when it affects their health, they'll blame personal choice. But there's a bigger social mechanism that's just as responsible, if not more responsible, in some ways.
I'm Robin Openshaw. I'm known as the GreenSmoothieGirl, and I have a great little gift for you today. Have you been troubled by the idea that there are genetically modified foods hiding in all the stuff that we buy in the grocery store? You may know that corn and soy are GMO, but then you see that it's organic and you think, is organic GMO? Is GMO organic? I can answer that question for you in just a second, but I want to let you know that the gift for you today is we've made a wallet card. You can grab it from us right here, it's free. And what we want you to do is just print it off and cut it out and put that wallet card in your purse or your wallet if you're a guy. And when you go to the store, you will now know the ingredients to look for and what foods have been genetically modified. The reason you want to avoid them is not only are they creating a lot of chaos in our environment, because when we change the genetics of a seed, of a plant, there are all kinds of downstream effects of that are just starting to show up. It looks like genetically modified foods are starting to show up in the form of a lot of autoimmune disease and probably cancer in human beings. As we eat these unnatural foods, some people call them frankenfoods, a lot of unnatural things happen in the human body and our body has to fight it and eventually ends up fighting itself. And so I'd love for you to be a part of voting with your dollars and not purchasing and not eating genetically modified foods. And I'm sure you're saying, yeah, sure, I'm game, but I just don't know when I go to the store what they are. Well, unfortunately, Monsanto and the other biotech companies, Dow Chemical and the others, are mega billion-dollar companies that are taking over control of seeds in our country, and they're making seeds that don't reproduce, and they're driving farmers into the ground who want to use heirloom seeds that do reproduce like they have for thousands of years. And Monsanto and these other biotech companies have convinced our government, even though it's now turning out to be a lie, that there will be higher crop yields using genetically modified seed. Guess what? It's not true. This wallet card that we're sending you will let you know what to look for, what ingredients GMOs are hiding in, because here's the thing, do not look to our government to protect us from genetically modified foods. Monsanto is currently winning. They've been winning and defeating citizen initiatives all over the country, and they're even starting to make inroads in Europe. There are 60 countries of the world that have limited or banned genetically modified foods coming into their borders. And I'm talking about the countries of Europe, I'm talking about Japan, I'm talking about Australia, other first world countries like us who have much more stringent controls on not wanting genetically modified foods in their food supply. Well, unfortunately, recently there's a major setback in the form of a law that, yes, manufacturers who have genetically modified foods in their products, which is almost everybody at this point, have to tell you, but you have to dig to find out. They don't have to put it on the label. They have to make it available somewhere. So you can't look at the package and necessarily know if you're buying a genetically modified food. That's why I want you to have this wallet card, because you as a consumer have to know what you're buying. So I hope this tool helps you. Feel free to make copies for friends. You might want to laminate it, but we need to spread the word that we as the consumers are the only ones who will be able to get rid of genetically modified foods in our food supply, and we will do it with our feet, and we will do it with our dollars. We will do it by not buying them. We have to do it through the law of supply and demand. So I hope that you'll join me in not buying genetically modified foods and in making a statement to manufacturers that we care about non-GMO. So this has been a little bit of a long video, but it's a very important subject. And so this is a movement. Join me. See you next time.
Hey, 42 here. Do you know what you're eating? I mean, do you really know? Because you may think you do, but you've been lied to your entire life. Now, this may be hard to stomach, but a lot of the food you eat is fake. Okay, this is not true for everyone watching. Different countries have vastly different food regulations, and some countries are far worse offenders at dishing up fake foods to its citizens. I'll reveal the worst countries for doing this in a minute, but first, let's take a jar of harmless honey. It's touted as one of nature's superfoods. It can prevent cancer, heart disease, it's a powerful probiotic, and it boosts your immune system. And all of that is true. If you're eating actual honey, that is. Germany is the world's largest importer of honey. Those Germans just love their honey. But the world's second largest importer of honey, America, tells a very different story when it comes to this supposedly wholly natural product. A study found that over 75% of honey sold in the US doesn't contain any honey. According to the FDA, honey has to contain pollen, otherwise it just isn't honey. It was discovered that the vast majority of commercial honey brands on the shelves in American stores contained no pollen at all, and therefore were not actually honey. So, if all this honey isn't honey, then what is it? Well, there are many different, carefully engineered cocktails of artificial ingredients that are used to replicate real honey, and each producer uses their own unique mixture. Most are mainly made up from the infamous high fructose corn syrup, sometimes labelled as maltolol syrup, which is cut with sucrose syrup and water. Sometimes some plant extracts and essential oils are thrown in there, if you're lucky. So, you thought you were being healthy by swapping your pancake syrup for honey, but in reality, it's probably the exact same thing. So, why do American honey producers sell billions of dollars worth of artificial sugars labelled as honey? Simple economics. Real honey is expensive. Just think about what has to happen to make honey. Bees have to visit 2 million flowers to produce just 1 cup of honey, travelling 55,000 miles in the process. And over its entire lifetime, a single bee will produce just half a teaspoon of honey. High fructose corn syrup and other similar ingredients are incredibly cheap to produce, and so companies can sell fake honey for much cheaper to consumers, who are none the wiser. There are also no regulations in place in America concerning the actual percentage of real honey content required. In Europe, there are very strict rules about what can be labelled and sold as honey. EU regulations stipulate that anything sold as honey must contain more than 60% actual honey. Seems fair enough. And they cannot contain more than 5% sucrose, i.e. syrups. The vast majority of honey sold across Europe was found to be 100% honey. Also, through no fault of their own, Americans are not used to the idea that honey crystallizes very quickly, and 100% raw honey will usually already be highly crystallized when you take it off the shelf. But honey never spoils, and crystallization is completely normal. After all, it is a sugar, and sugar just loves to crystallize. Europeans have always been sold crystallized honey, and so are used to the idea. A survey found that most Americans would wrongly consider crystallized honey to be spoiled. But when you're selling syrups disguised as honey, you don't have to worry about crystallization. 2.3 billion cups of coffee are drank every day around the world. But what goes into your cup? Let me guess. Ground coffee, or instant coffee if you're an animal, hot water, then maybe milk or cream, and perhaps some sugar. Oh, and of course, let's not forget the wheat, soybeans, seeds, corn, twigs, and dirt. Yes, you heard me correctly. Your ground coffee, which should just be coffee, right, actually contains a whole array of fillers, and more often than not, these fillers contain twigs and dirt. Well, you did say you like your coffees with an earthy flavour. Coffee is in trouble. Big trouble. Coffee is very sensitive. It doesn't like being called names, but it's also very picky about where it's grown. The plant will only produce coffee seeds, known to us all as coffee beans, in humid and very altitudinous mountainous areas. According to several experts, climate change is threatening these sensitive environments, and forecasts show that by 2050, half of the regions in the world where coffee can be grown will be lost forever. And by 2080, coffee could go extinct. Due to these growing fears, some unscrupulous ground coffee manufacturers have resorted to padding out their coffee using fillers such as soybeans, brown sugar, barley and corn. Some byproducts of coffee production that should really be removed from the final product are also purposely being left in to fill it out, such as wood, twigs, parchment, husks and even soil. If you buy whole beans, then don't worry, there won't be any fillers in there. Brazilian scientists were so concerned about this that they developed a brand new technique using liquid chromatography and statistical analysis that allowed them to detect exactly what percentage of a bag of ground coffee is actual coffee. The procedure is 95% accurate, and what they discovered was that some brands of ground coffee have such a high percentage of fillers in them that they must be purposely added in. There's just no way it's an accident. If coffee isn't your thing, then maybe orange juice is. You may have been told many times that most orange juices are artificial, but do you really know just how artificial? What if I told you that the flavour of most major orange juice brands is 100% fake? To make orange juice, you just squeeze oranges, right? Maybe throw in some preservatives and added sugar. No, that would just be too simple for big brand orange juices. They squeeze their oranges, and then they remove all of the oxygen from the extracted juice. This allows the juice to keep for a year without spoiling. Yes, your morning juice is anywhere from a few months to a year old. But that's not all that removing the oxygen does. It also removes all of the natural flavour, and I mean all of it. So they're left with a very old, completely tasteless liquid that slightly resembles something that came out of an orange once. The orange flavour is then artificially re-added to the juice using a concoction of artificial flavourings. But why purposely remove the flavour and then put it back in again if it only makes it worse? I mean, that's not easy or cheap to do. Well, it's all about consistency. Each big brand orange juice has their own unique flavour that their customers are all very familiar with. Just imagine if the taste of Tropicana changed slightly. Millions of people would notice and kick up a big storm about it all. The natural flavour from oranges is just not consistent enough to stick a brand name on it and have people associate that flavour with that particular brand, because the flavour would constantly change, depending on the variety of the orange, location of the oranges and the time of year. Orange juice manufacturers spend millions hiring flavour and fragrance experts, the very same people that work for large perfume companies, to create a unique and recognisable orange juice-like flavour for their product. They call these flavour packs. And the worst part is that the flavourings don't even have to be listed under the ingredients, because they're derived from orange oils, which is a dubious claim, but it technically means that these artificially flavoured drinks can be sold as 100% orange juice. So, that's orange juice. I bet you're wondering which of your favourite foods I'm going to ruin next. What about a simple steak? No, not the steak. A steak is just a single cut of beef, right? What could possibly be suspicious about that? Well, if you opt for cheaper steaks, whether it be from the supermarket or even your local butcher, you could be eating tens of different cattle in a single steak. You're purchasing Frankenstein steaks that have actually been glued together from a whole array of offcuts. And this doesn't just happen with beef, it could be lamb, pork, venison, or any meat really. When many animals are being turned into various types of small food products ready to throw into a pan at home, a lot of waste is created and general chunks of meat that would most likely get thrown away. Some unscrupulous companies and butchers use a meat glue called transglutaminase, which is well known within the food industry and is completely untraceable within the final product. They basically glue together the leftover pieces, which could have come from many different cows, to create one big Frankenstein steak for your enjoyment. Transglutaminase is so good at fusing meat together, it would take an expert to examine a steak very closely to detect any wrongdoing. The best part? It's not a legal requirement to list it as an ingredient. So to be safe, just stay away from cheap steak. But what if you already do? Maybe you are a cow connoisseur who opts to spend $40, $50 or even $100 plus on a single steak in a restaurant. And your favourite steak of all is of course the very pricey Kobe beef. The Kobe beef craze has taken America in particular by storm. Thousands of restaurants all over the country and many large chains now offer highly prized and highly priced Kobe beef burgers, Kobe steaks and other Kobe beef products on their menus. Kobe beef comes from Kobe cows, a breed of Wagyu beef that comes from Japan. The steaks they produce are prized by chefs all over the world for their impressive fat marbling, flavour and that melt in your mouth texture. It is the ultimate steak. But it's incredibly exclusive. Kobe beef can only come from Japan, and just 3,000 cattle are deemed worthy enough to be slaughtered and turned into Kobe beef each year. They are all fathered by just 12 highly prized bulls that are considered genetically ideal. Sounds to me like they're trying to create a cow master race over there. Kobe cows are fed beer and sake to improve flavour, and every cow is massaged daily to improve its fat marbling. Hell, I want to be a Kobe cow. Now that is some serious dedication to creating a tasty steak, and it doesn't come cheap. It varies, but it will cost you on average about $350 to eat a real Kobe steak in a restaurant. Because supplies are purposely kept small to focus on quality, the amount of real Kobe beef that reaches the US each year would only feed 77 Americans. And yet, millions of Americans are going out and regularly eating Kobe beef in restaurants and buying it from the shop to cook at home for far, far less than $350 per steak. So what's going on here? It is one of the biggest food scams in America's history. As you have probably guessed by now, the vast majority of so-called Kobe beef sold in America is just plain old regular beef that has never even been to Japan. It's just outright lying and clever marketing, if you can call it clever. Some farms in America are even now creating fake Kobe beef for much cheaper, often called Phoebe beef by those in the know. This fake Kobe is sold to thousands of restaurants, and customers pay upwards of $100 a steak for it. But in reality, there are only 9 restaurants in the whole of America that sells real Kobe beef, imported from Japan. Yes, just 9. And they have a special license allowing them to cook and sell it. The fake food that you consume in the average day is sickening. Your olive oil is actually peanut oil, soybean oil and palm oil. Your cheese and even bread contains wood pulp. Yes, wood pulp, which the FDA says is safe to eat. Thanks for the advice, but last time I checked, I wasn't a beaver. Your dried spices and herbs contain a large amount of garden weeds. Your tea contains sawdust and sand. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Blueberries are also often faked. Most products containing blueberries, such as muffins, cereals and pancakes, contain precisely 0 blueberries. Real blueberries are expensive, and so food scientists have perfected a recipe of sugar, purple dye and other questionable ingredients to craft imitation blueberries that have no health benefits whatsoever. In America, most of the champagne sold is not actually champagne. Most people believe that it's illegal to sell sparkling wine as champagne if it doesn't originate from the Champagne province in France and it is produced using the méthode champenoise, a second fermentation within the bottle. Well, yes, this is true in every country in the world except America. A 100-year-old legal loophole allows any American sparkling wine, a simple bottle of Californian bubbly for example, which may be nice, to be sold as champagne, which it isn't, within America. Do this in any other country and French lawsuits would take your fake champers off of the shelves faster than you can say, is this the bloody French Inquisition or what? Of course, all of this changes depending on where you live in the world. Every country has its own unique food regulations and different levels of food quality. But which countries have the most fake food? And which have the least? British charity Oxfam conducted a study comparing the quality of foods in every country in the world. The best countries in the world overall for food quality and lack of food-related health issues were found to be the Netherlands, France, Switzerland, Denmark and Sweden. Well done guys. But shockingly, at the other end of the spectrum was America. For quality and health-related food issues, the USA ranked 120th out of 125 countries, putting it in the same league as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Ethiopia and Chad. It's one of life's great ironies that the world's wealthiest superpower has some of the lowest quality food in the world. But it's not the fault of the American people. Large American food companies that have monopolized the market use every trick in the book and some horrifying techniques and chemicals to make terribly poor quality food seem more appealing to shoppers. And in America and some other countries, the regulations just aren't in place to properly regulate what goes into people's food. At least they're nowhere near stringent enough. But just remember, every time you shop, you are voting. Avoiding cheap, processed and general dodgy looking food will reduce the demand for it. Choosing to instead shop at local stores with real high quality food will make a difference, and you'll live a longer and happier life for it as well, just for the sake of a bit less convenience. You wouldn't eat garbage out of the bin, so don't settle for buying it off the shelves. Thanks for watching.